Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today, we'll explore how Miss Nghia and Mr. Tuan quietly sets a plan in motion, one that pulls Uri and Linh toward a perfect future without anyone seeing the strings. Behind closed doors, every message, every guest list, and every public moment becomes a weapon or a shield. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. The top floor lights were meant to be dead by midnight. Yet one window stayed alive, steady, stubborn like a heartbeat, refusing to quiet down. Inside that lit room, Miss Nghia sat perfectly upright behind her desk, hair pinned cleanly, blouse collar crisp, the kind of stillness that made the air feel managed. A cup of tea rested untouched in her right hand. In front of her, a neat stack of folders, edges aligned so sharply they looked measured with a ruler. The curtains were drawn. The door was locked. A soft knock tapped the wood twice, then a pause, as if the person outside knew the room itself could bite. "Come in, miss," Nghia said. Not loud, just final. Mr. Tuan slipped inside with the careful quiet of a man who'd learned that a hallway has ears. He shut the door behind him, glanced through the glass strip to confirm no shadow lingered, then faced her. "You called," he said. "I don't call people at this hour unless the ground is shifting," she replied. Her finger tapped the top folder thin spine, a red line running down it like a warning. "Sit." He sat across from her, smoothing his sleeves once, twice an old habit, a small ritual to buy time. "This is about Uri." Miss Nghia didn't answer right away. She opened the folder and slid one page forward. Not a contract. A schedule. Meetings. Dinners. A charity gala. Press appearances. The kind of public rhythm that could make a person look unshakable or guilty. Several names were blacked out, but the gaps weren't random. The blank spaces themselves formed a picture. Mr. Tuan's eyes moved line by line. His expression tightened. "You want to control the narrative." "You say that like it's optional, miss," Nghia replied. "Right now, the company doesn't need more truth. It needs something repeatable. Something clean enough that strangers can't smear it with their mouths." He lifted his gaze. "A wedding, miss." Ghia's face stayed calm, but her eyes sharpened with conviction. "A wedding is not romance. A wedding is a lock." "A lock," he repeated, slower. "A lock on rumors," she said. "A lock on chaos. A lock on anyone who thinks they can pull Uri in whatever direction benefits them." Mr. Tuan leaned back, a controlled exhale leaking out of him like steam. "You're talking about Linh. I'm talking about the most practical solution, miss," Nghia said. He stared at the schedule again, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something kinder. "Uri doesn't marry for practicality. He doesn't have to marry for love either, miss," Nghia said, voice level as a judge. "He has to marry with timing." Mr. Tuan's jaw flexed. "So we push him. We guide him," she corrected smoothly. "When you call it pushing, it sounds ugly." "I don't do ugly, Mr. Tuan. I will clean." The silence that followed was heavy, not empty, but crowded with consequences. Mr. Tuan broke it first. "And Linh just agrees to be guided?" A faint breath escaped Miss Nghia, almost amused, almost pitying. "Linh has waited for an opening long enough. Give her the door and she'll walk through it smiling." "That's exactly what worries me," he said, and there was nothing theatrical in his tone, only experience. "Linh isn't a quiet pawn. Give her a title, and she'll start measuring curtains for a throne. Miss. Ngia's gaze went colder. Then the throne will be decorative. He blinked. Decorative? A crown can shine without power, she said. I'm not handing her keys to the kingdom. I'm placing her somewhere she feels important and stays predictable. His eyes drifted to the second folder on her desk, thicker, clipped tight. He pointed with a subtle tilt of his chin. What's that one? The structure. Miss. Nghia slid it toward him without hesitation. Mr. Tuan opened it, and the air in the room changed. Pages of bullet points. Steps. Timelines. Pressure points. The kind of plan you used for an acquisition, not a marriage. His fingers slowed as he read aloud under his breath. Step 1. Put Lin into Uri's daily orbit. Miss. Nghia nodded once. Professionally, not romantically. People believe what they see repeatedly. He turned a page. Step 2. Create a natural public moment. A charity gala, she said, tapping the schedule. A photo. A headline. Something soft enough to look accidental, but strong enough to become gossip. And step 3. Mr. Tuan's voice dipped, as if the words themselves might leave fingerprints. Confirm engagement. Miss. Ngheia's expression didn't move. Not announced. Confirm. Announcing makes it look like we started it. Confirming makes it look like it was always true. He stared at her. This is a trap with velvet curtains. It's a rescue with velvet curtains, she corrected. If this fails, everything burns. The company. Uri's credibility. Every deal that's balancing on his name. Mr. Tuan let out a humorless laugh. You're planning a marriage like you plan a merger. Because the consequences are the same, she said simply. He swallowed, then pointed to one line, written more bluntly than the rest. Apply pressure through reputation. You're going to use the public against him, he said. Miss. Ngia's face turned unyielding, not cruel, not angry, just made of steel. The public is already being used against him. I'm redirecting the weapon. Mr. Tuan's shoulders rose and fell once, as if he was trying to breathe around the weight of it. What do you need from me? You handle logistics, Miss. Nghia said. Channels. Timing. Clean communication. No trails that lead back to this room. And Lin? Miss. Ngia's lips curved almost like a smile, but without warmth. Leave Lin to me. As if her name carried its own shadow, the room felt a degree colder. Mr. Tuan gathered the papers, careful not to disturb their perfect edges. Then he paused, voice quiet. There's always a price for a secret. Miss. Nghia finally lifted her tea and took one slow sip. Of course. That's why we don't pay it in public. A hum from the air conditioner. The faint throb of the city beyond the glass. A moment of controlled stillness. Then Mr. Tuan's phone vibrated once. He glanced down. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked like someone pulled a plug. Miss. Nghia noticed immediately. What is it? His thumb hovered, then he turned the screen toward her. A message preview, short, almost careless, yet sharp enough to cut the room open. He's asking about Lin and the gala. Miss. Nghia set her cup down with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Don't delete anything, she said. Mr. Tuan's voice dropped to a whisper. Miss. Nghia, it looks like someone is watching the steps before we even take them. Her composure shifted just a flicker, quick and real, then returned. smoother than before, like a blade sliding back into its sheath. "Then we move faster," she said. "And we move smarter. Mister." Tuan started to speak again, but the phone vibrated a second time longer. He flipped it over. Another message appeared. Worse. Cleaner. More dangerous because it didn't sound like a rumor. It sounded like a fact. Uri changed the guest list. Lin's name was added by Uri. Mister. Tuan froze, staring at the screen as if it could blink and say it was a mistake. He added her himself. Miss. Nghia stared too. For the first time tonight, her expression didn't look victorious. It looked cautious. Because Uri wasn't supposed to move first. And in a room built for control, the smallest unexpected move could become a storm. Miss. Nghia didn't blink for a full second. She just stared at the screen, as if the words might confess their motive. Uri added her, Mister. Tuan repeated, still stuck between disbelief and dread. That wasn't us. No, miss. Nghia said quietly. That was him. Mister. Tuan lowered the phone, voice tightening. So what now? Do we proceed? Or do we stop before we step into his trap? Miss. Nghia rose from her chair. Not hurriedly measured. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back a few centimeters. The city lights bled in, thin and cold. When a man moves first, she said, it means two things. Either he wants the outcome, or he wants to see who else wants it. Mister. Tuan's brow furrowed. You think he's testing us? I think he's testing everyone, miss. Nghia replied. And I don't intend to fail. She turned back, calm returning like a mask snapping into place. We don't cancel. We reframe. Mister. Tuan leaned forward. How? We stop trying to push Lin into his life, miss. Nghia said. Uri already placed her near him. That's our advantage. Mister. Tuan's eyes narrowed. Or our warning. Miss. Nghia returned to her desk and tapped the plan folder again, this time on a different line, one that had been quiet until now. Contain risk through controlled access. We give Lin access, she said, but only the kind that looks flattering and feels important. No sensitive files. No private meetings with investors. Nothing that can be weaponized. Mister. Tuan's voice dropped. And if she tries anyway, miss? Nghyia's gaze sharpened. Then she exposes herself. In front of the only person whose opinion matters. He hesitated. Uri doesn't like being handled. Then we don't handle him, she said. We handle the stage. Mister. Tuan exhaled slowly, as if he finally understood the shape of it. The gala. The gala, miss. Nghia confirmed. We let Uri believe he's driving. We let Lin believe she's chosen. And we let the public believe it's fate. He gave a short, uneasy laugh. That's a lot of believing. Miss. Nghia reached for a pen and wrote 2 words in the margin of the schedule, bold enough to feel like a verdict. Niche narrative. We seed one story, she said. One simple line the press can repeat without thinking. Uri is stepping into stability. Lin is stepping into loyalty. The company is stepping into peace. Mister. Tuan looked up. And if Uri asks who started it, Miss. Nghyia's smile was small and dangerous. We tell the truth. Mister. Tuan blinked. The truth? We say, you did, miss. Nghia replied. Because his signature is already on the guest list. Silence landed again, thick, heavy, final. Mr. Tuan stood, pocketing his phone. I'll tighten the guest list, secure the photographers, and control the seating. No loose ends. And, Miss. Nghia added, voice like a blade sliding into velvet. Keep Lin within arm's reach of visibility. People behave differently when they know they're being seen. Mr. Tuan nodded once, then paused at the door. Miss Nghia, if Uri is testing us, he's not the only one. She met his eyes. Good, she said. I prefer a game when I can see the board. When he left, the door clicked shut, and Miss Nghia sat down again, but she didn't touch the tea. Her fingers rested on the folder like it was a pulse she could control, and for the first time that night, her breathing wasn't perfectly even. Because somewhere, beyond her locked room, Uri was already moving pieces. And the most unpredictable piece was smiling. On the lower floor of the company, under the cold glow of office lights, Lin sat at a pristine desk, a new nameplate still sharp, still smelling like fresh plastic. Her hands glided over a keyboard with practiced ease as an email notification popped up on her screen. Private secretary assignment, effective immediately. Lin's lips curled into a satisfied smile, so soft it looked innocent. But her eyes, bright, hungry, awake at this hour, never looked innocent at all.
Bà Nghĩa và ông Tuấn gặp nhau vào đêm khuya để bí mật định hình tương lai cho Uri, coi đám cưới như một tấm vé khóa chống lại tin đồn và hỗn loạn. Kế hoạch của họ rất chính xác, đưa Linh vào vòng xoáy cuộc sống hàng ngày của Uri, dàn dựng khoảnh khắc công khai tự nhiên tại một buổi dạ tiệc, sau đó xác nhận lễ đính hôn mà không để lại dấu vết nào. Ông Tuấn lo sợ Linh sẽ tìm kiếm quyền lực, nhưng bà Nghĩa muốn cho cô ấy sự nổi bật chứ không phải quyền kiểm soát. Kế hoạch đột nhiên thay đổi khi Uri tự mình thêm Linh vào danh sách khách mời dạ tiệc, ngụ ý rằng anh ta là thử thách mọi người. Bà Nghĩa định hình lại chiến lược kiểm soát quyền tiếp cận, kiểm soát câu chuyện để Uri tin rằng anh ta là người lãnh đạo. Ở tầng dưới, Linh nhận nhiệm vụ thư ký riêng và mỉm cười đầy hào hứng chờ đợi những điều sắp tới.